All right, guys, welcome back. We are going to be going over in this video our next hook in React's new features, React hooks, which is the useEffect hook, which is a hook that a lot of developers find themselves reaching out for on a pretty regular basis that allows us to do things that were normally reserved for the lifecycle methods, componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate, and a few other things. Before we jump into that, though, let's do a quick review of where we've been at so far in the previous two videos. The first video, we went through all of the specifics of how to build this very small counter application that you see here, which increments the count up and decrements the count down, and some other functionality that we haven't recreated yet in this version. But we built out that React application from scratch using basic class-based components. Then we started refactoring, and we started refactoring so that we can use the most common React hook, which is the useState hook, which you see right here. And we're using the useState hook so that we can take our what was a class-based component and turn it into a functional component, which drastically decreases the amount of boilerplate and really just makes our code a little bit more readable, in my opinion. So we're using the useState hook so that we can get access to state in a functional component, which before React hooks was not possible. So here, we're utilizing the useState hook. We're passing in an argument of 0. Now that 0 is going to be used as the initial value of the piece of state we're creating. The useState hook returns out an array, and we're using array deconstruction to create variables associated with each element in that array. The first variable is count, which is actually going to hold our piece of state. And then change count is the method that the useState hook returns to us so that we can then later on update that piece of state. And we are passing in, we're using those values. First, we're passing the count value into our count component. Then we're creating an increment count and decrement count handler function. And we're passing both those functions into the increment and decrement component, which is what allows us to increment the count and decrement the count. All right, that was just a quick review of what we've done so far, but there's one more piece of functionality that we haven't been able to recreate just yet, and this is where the useEffect hook is going to come in. If you remember, or if you look back at our previous video, our very first video in this mini-series, we created this counter application to have one more piece of functionality, which was in the title of the browser tab itself, we were setting the value, the text there, to be something different than what you see here. Right now, it just says React Practice. But in our other application, we had our application when it first rendered, it stated in the tab neutral. And this was going to kind of be what we need as the status of our counter. And as we clicked the increment button, that neutral text would change to the words going up. And when we click down, it would change to the words going down. Now, we don't yet have that functionality going on here, but we are going to recreate it with one of our hooks. Because before, we had to use lifecycle methods to make this happen. But the whole point of, not the whole point, but one of the main points of using React hooks is to get away from having to use class-based components. All right, so in order to do this, first thing we're going to do is not actually going to be pulling in the useEffect hook. First thing we're going to do is we need to create another piece of state that we can then use to set the value of whatever this title is here. So to do that, we are simply going to run the useState method again and pass to it whatever we want the initial value of this piece of state to be, which in this case is going to be the string neutral. There it is. Now we know that the useState method returns to us an array of values. So we're going to use array deconstruction again. And we're going to say that the names of the first value in that array, which is going to be our piece of state, we're going to call it status. And then the second value is going to be the method that we use to update that status. So we're going to call it change status. And just to make sure that we're completely clear on what these things are, let's go ahead and console log both of those values. So the first one we're going to console log is status. And the second one that we're going to console log is, oh, it actually says stats. Is going to be change status. change status. All right, and let's see what comes up over here. Our application re-renders, and we see that status is the string neutral, and change status is this entire function definition here, which will, when we call it, allows us to update that piece of state. All right, now we're going to bring in our new React hook. And the React hook that we're going to utilize for this is going to be the useEffect hook, because we're essentially, we want to reach out from our React application and create some sort of side effect. Again, the example here that we're using is we're reaching out and we're actually using one of the DOM APIs, the web browser's DOM API. And we're going to specifically be targeting the title property on that DOM API to set the value of what our title in our tab is. So let's go ahead and see kind of like what this might look like. So first, let's pull in our useEffect hook to do this. We're going to go up here and we're simply going to add useEffect right there. Now, inside of our application, we can actually run the useEffect hook. We're going to run right here, useEffect. And the useEffect hook is designed to take in an argument, or at least its first argument is a callback function. And this callback function will be ran at certain times in the lifecycle of our application, of our component. So let's go ahead and see what times those are. Console log useEffect ran foo. All right, and let's watch our application re-render and let's see what happens. All right, so initially when our application gets mounted to the DOM, as soon as it gets mounted to the DOM, it runs that piece of code. Now, the cool part about this is that every single subsequent re-render, that piece of code, that useEffect callback function runs again. Now you may be thinking to yourself, Phillip, like, why is that such a big deal? Big deal, like, that's not that big of a deal. But if you remember, in our original implementation of this application, we had to double the amount of code that we were writing because we wanted it to run, again, once the application mounted, once the app component mounted, but also every time that it remounted, when it re-rendered, when it was updated. And to do that, in our class-based components, we had to use two different lifecycle methods, componentDidMount and componentDidUpdate. Utilizing the useEffect hook, we only need to write it one time. So this is a nice little optimization that we're getting just from the useEffect hook. All right, but now of course we don't want this thing to just console log effect ran foo every single time we call it. We want it to do something more meaningful. So we are going to utilize the DOM API for this. And the code for this would look like document.title equals something, whatever we want it to equal, right? And when our application re-renders, we'll see that our title up here changes to something. We don't want it to change to something. We want it to change to whatever the status is currently of our application, which in this instance is neutral. So in order to do this, we're going to utilize this status variable right here. Oh, that changed quickly. And then when our application re-renders, over here, we're going to see neutral. Fantastic. But we still don't yet have the functionality of it changing at all at any point in time, even when we increment or decrement the count. To do that, we're going to need to add some code to our increment count handler function and our decrement count handler function. So instead of just incrementing the count, we also want to change the status of our piece of status or piece of state. This is called status. We're going to use the change status method to do this. So inside of our increment count handler function, we are going to change status, and we're going to set it equal to something new. So when we're incrementing the count, we want it to change to going up. Let's go ahead and copy this and let's drop this into the decrement. And when we decrement the count, we want to say going down. Good. Let our application re-render and see what we got going on. When we click, when it initially renders, it says neutral, fantastic. When we increment, it says going up. And when we decrement, it says going down. Fantastic. We have now rebuilt our entire application utilizing React hooks, and we created an app component that was completely functional. It was not a class component at all. It was a functional component utilizing our new hook features. This is amazing. Our application is easier to read. Our application has less code. In my opinion, it's more easy to maintain. Wonderful. We're going to find out, though, In the next video, we're gonna take a quick break here. We're gonna come back in our next video. We're gonna do another really cool feature of React hooks, which is we're gonna create our first custom hook, where we're essentially going to take all of this information, all of this code that we just wrote right here in order to get this functionality in this counter we're gonna pull it out and make it reusable. We're gonna see what that looks like in just a second. So see you in just a minute, guys.